Hello and welcome to Table Talk, a show where I chat with other creators in the TTRPG space about how they run their tables. I'm Danger Dan Jers, the GM and host of D&Dark, and joining us at the table today is Cav from the Only Wizards in the Dungeon podcast.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Hello, thank you for being here.
Luckily, we're both on the Pacific Standard Time, so it's no sweat on my back.
Absolutely.
Off my back, you know.
You have that intro at the beginning of your stuff about how you're recording in the Pacific Northwest on, was it Tribal Land?
Yeah, so I'm from Vancouver. Everyone in the podcast that has been on the podcast here has been from Vancouver. We're like locals. And it's kind of a thing in Vancouver too. This comes from my undergraduate degree, but like in UBC, for example, it's pretty standard to do like land acknowledgements before you open up public spaces. So we were like, well, let's do that. We should probably have a land acknowledgement too. And then we kind of go from there, even though we live in different parts of the city.
That's awesome. I really appreciate that you guys do that. For most of us at D&Dark, we're spread out across mostly different parts of California, but we do have one of our players is in Washington. We've had a couple of guests from other states. A couple of friends from Texas have been on. I'm going to be having a guest on soon that's in Chicago. So we kind of branch out a little bit further than that. The land acknowledgement is a great thing. That's not really something that I've heard before, but it's a good way to get kind of the wheels turning and be cognizant of that.
Yeah. I mean, my background is in anthropology from my undergraduate, so it makes a lot of sense that I guess I was like, let's do this. But also, yeah, I feel like it's useful. And I don't, especially there's so much, I mean, this is more like, indigenous rights, but we'll go back to TTRPGs, but like, it is very, I think good to always recognize kind of like the land you're on and like the history of it and things like that. I'm a history buff, so I'm kind of also like, I find that very useful. We also wanted to include it because we wanted to be like, hey, we're from Vancouver. Like, if anyone is from Vancouver or from the West Coast, we're your West Coast people. Hi.
Anyway, though, thank you for being on, and why don't you tell us a little bit about your show?
Yeah, so our show is Only Wizards in the Dungeon podcast. We are kind of a TTRPG variety show, actually. It's kind of the best way to put it. We started off in D&D 5e. That was our first story. That's actually one of the reasons I reached out to you to say hi, was that we were doing like D&D 5e, but also kind of exploring the idea of D&D monsters in 5e and what that looked like, and trying to take it into a new direction, kind of take a typical D&D monster and give it a new spin. But we ended up, we're all really new to this. Like we're very like a young group of people who are trying to figure out like, how does this work? How does podcasting work? How does TTRPGs work? And we actually found ourselves really enjoying the aspect of kind of smaller, shorter stories, but like trying out many different versions of TTRPGs. And so we've actually released something new, which I'm excited to plug, which is what we're calling Agency Archives, the Agency Archives. Our first campaign was Monster Mash. Now we're doing the Agency Archives, which is essentially kind of like, have you ever seen the British show Taskmaster?
I've seen bits and pieces of it.
We also described it in our meetings of discussing it kind of like Loki, like the TVA, and that is definitely a vibe. But we're doing that now, so it's actually really exciting to kind of do a lot of various TTRPGs. Where this whole other series is going to be us actually swapping rule sets a lot and doing like shorter kind of content, but therefore like trying out different TTRPGs people may have never played before.
That actually gets into the core of what I wanted to chat and discuss with you, because from my count, you have played essentially 8 different TTRPG systems on your show. You've got D&D 5e, Kids on Bikes, Kids on Brooms, Teens in Space, Blades in the Dark, Glitter Hearts, Fate Core, and then you're kind of doing your own amalgam of several different systems. Did I miss anything?
We just did, actually. The only one that's new is the one from Agency Archives, which is Perils and Princesses, which is the one we just did for a sort of princess-themed game where one person played Princess Chicken Parmigiano and another person played Princess Glog McLaughlin, which was interesting.
Very D&D names.
Very D&D names. But yeah, it was actually a really cool system. But we've done a lot. We actually, on our next kind of thing, we're going We're doing one altered D&D 5e for the next episode, and then I'm really hoping to do something like Vampire the Masquerade, or like even like a My Little Pony TTRPG, because those exist, and I haven't seen anyone do them yet for like an audio.
One of the players on our team, Daniel, who plays Imhotep, he is a hoarder of systems, and he's got the My Little Pony, I believe the Power Rangers, and Transformers RPGs all run off of the same system. So I know that he's got the capability of doing those, and he's actually planning on doing a Power Rangers one-shot mini campaign with us at some point. So I'm very curious about exploring all of those, and I would love to hear what your experience has been like jumping around all of these different systems and kind of what you've learned from dipping your toes into a pretty wide pool of TTRPGs.
Yeah. This also, I feel like I need to preface with the fact that I went to school for game design before kind of going and doing this podcast. And I met a lot of people who actually opened me up to some indie RPGs, and there's just so much variety out there. I found that, a lot of people start with D&D 5e, and it has its strengths and its weaknesses, and it has flexibility, but it also sometimes lacks specificity and is missing some rules. There's a whole thing about how people play the game and they sometimes use rules and then they don't use rules sometimes. So there's so much variety. I feel like one of the things I've learned from just exposing myself and exposing people to different systems, playing different systems, has been that so much of what makes a system work is like what the players find interesting and what they really vibe with. Some people I know love, like we had one of our cast members in the first campaign, Selena's, she loves the kind of silly aspect and the more open aspect of Kids on Bikes, the fact that it's more rules light, that combat is resolved quickly and without a lot of additional rules. I also know people who love gritty combat and like having lots of powers like in a video game. And then I have people who are chaos goblins, like Will, who's in our podcast, who absolutely is more chaotic. So every system kind of caters to a different person and a different style. Some people are very particular about the games they play, and they want to have systems that are really supporting role play, and some are like, no, I want to grittily change my stats. So yeah, it's been interesting to explore all of those options.
So when you're doing stories that are exploring those options, what's the process like of deciding what system to do for a given story? Are you basing that around the people that you're bringing to each campaign? Is that a thing that you decide beforehand? Tell me a little bit about what that's like, since it is something that is so kind of specific to the people that you're playing with.
One of the things is communication first up. When we were doing new settings in the past, I would give kind of a primer as to what they were and how they worked. And we chose systems that actually were, I think, easy for people to get into or use, especially for guests and things like that. Like Kids on Bikes and Glitter Hearts and all that stuff was played because we knew that they'd be accessible for new people while also providing a new theme. With the agency archives, because we're playing with my brother Grayson and Will, they have had more exposure. So they're kind of being thrown into the weeds and given systems they have to learn, but they're comfortable with that. But at the same time, every time a new system is created, there has to be something in there for them to explore and kind of have fun with. So I feel like a lot of it is like you've probably experienced as a DM, coming up with rules changes on the spot, figuring out how to adapt something or change something that isn't working, providing opportunities for every player to explore what they want to explore, ignoring or skipping past parts that don't feel good, which has happened a few times in what we've recorded. Something just doesn't vibe.
Absolutely. I'm very big on compromise as a GM. So no matter what system we're working in, a lot of the times I'll try to get to the core of what is it that my players are trying to accomplish? What is it that you want to do? And if the rules don't really support that, I want to help meet you halfway. We can bend the rules, maybe not in the way that you're wanting to, but we can bend the rules this way to get the same outcome you're going from. And I know that some systems are more flexible than others to that capacity. That's one of the things that I like about 5e is that it is really modular, and so that you kind of have that flexibility a bit more than with some other systems. The ones that I've played, I've only really played 3. I've played 5e, I've played Pathfinder, and I played Call of Cthulhu, which each of them have their own different strengths and weaknesses. Between the 3 of them, I like aspects of each of them. I would say my favorite is probably Call of Cthulhu. It's got its own bag of weeds there, though. It's a great system to run. It is a hard system to prep for. and to build a campaign in, but absolutely tons of fun with a much more daunting horror type setting that is a lot more brutal on the players, which is kind of a funny juxtaposition to the more power fantasy centric 5e and Pathfinder. From your experience of the systems that you've played, do any of them really jump out at you as your personal favorites? And like, what are some of the things that have come up in your games that, from a game system perspective, have been the things that you've latched onto as your favorites? So like, as an example, for me with Call of Cthulhu, I adore their luck system. I don't know if you've played Call of Cthulhu or are familiar with the system.
I'm familiar, but I've yet to play. We're actually going to definitely use it for an arc. But I've heard of the luck system. I know exactly what you're talking about. It's very cool.
One of my personal favorite things is risk-reward trade-offs, and that is like the epitome of a high-risk, high-reward system.
Yeah, you're right. Absolutely. Because combat is so much more deadly, and you do need to use your luck as a limited resource to get out of sticky situations. That also doesn't surprise me, though. I feel like your podcast with D&Dark has been kind of exploring kind of dark movie monsters to also have your favorite system be kind of the darker Call of Cthulhu. It totally tracks.
We are definitely, even though we are more horror-centric in our theming, we still tend to skew very campy and silly. I say we're a comedy horror podcast. We are more horror theming than actual horror as a genre. We do have our moments when we do get darker, but I, for one, like to embrace the kind of camp and silliness of, like, if you look at, for our main campaign, a lot of the monsters and movies and books and like that gothic literature that we're drawing inspiration from, they have such a history of camp and of going over the top. Like, especially in the film universe, the shared universe of Universal Monsters gets to a point of such insane ridiculousness once you start getting far enough into where they are crossing over regularly. That's kind of an aspect that I love to embrace thematically with our shows. But anyway, to circle back around to the question, like for me, the Call of Cthulhu luck mechanic, is there anything like that that's jumped out at you in any of these different systems that you've played in or games that put any particular system in a special place for you specifically?
That's a great question. I feel like every system probably has like a mechanic I could give you, actually, that I'm like, but just to kind of keep it, straightforward and not to go through every single system we've run. Kids on Bikes has a system that's actually called adversity tokens. And it's a system I really love and that none of my players ever remember. It essentially works as a system where when you fail, you get a point that you can essentially use to improve someone else's or your own role later. So it's supposed to incentivize people to try things and mess up, but then they still can maybe do something together that would like be more clutch in that special moment. And I think that kind of ties into that idea of, again, like risk reward, like systems like that are GM driven. They're inherently oppositional. So they do require an idea of like the players have to have a way to kind of do that special haha got you moment because it feels good. And the DM has all the power and all the cards. They know what's going on, but you don't. So I like systems that will, do that and make it a lot easier to have those really fun moments for players where they feel like they've done something really cool and kind of beat the DM in an interesting way. There's also like just kind of not even mechanic related to playing the game, but there's a few systems we've played that have had really good rules for character creation that I think go above and beyond 5e and some other games, which are so much focused on your own personal character. Glitter Hearts is inspired by other systems like this. Kids on Bikes has it as well. Basically, personal questions that connect you to people in the party or to things in the setting, which I think is really cool. There's been a push for more systems that allow for players to build their own settings collaboratively before they go into the game at all, and how they relate to each other as people. Because otherwise, it is like it could just be a bunch of adventurers enter a tavern and no one has anything in common. And I think that that's kind of a cool mechanic that's shifting in the TTRPG space, more of these interpersonal questions. And I've seen that in Glitter Hearts. I've seen that in Kids on Bikes, Teens in Space. Obviously, all the kids games, they're all kind of connected. But I've also started to see it in other settings that we're kind of exploring and going forward with.
I've definitely seen a big push towards increased player agency just across the board, whether that's in systems that are building into that or shows that are kind of taking that philosophy into 5e. And it is something that I do enjoy, and I think that the story that we tell collaboratively is so much better than anything that I would have come up with on my own. I find that the more that I go with my players' instincts, even to the detriment of my own plans, the better the story becomes. I very rarely will have an instant where I've told a player no and then not regretted it later.
Yeah.
Or the other way around, where I've said yes to a player's insane idea and not immediately benefited from it.
Yeah.
Having their input on the world and story building and in kind of fleshing out the setting and stuff like that is absolutely fantastic. And there's a lot of, I will kind of tease, we're in about like the last quarter of our main campaign. So we're starting to put an eye towards our second campaign, and it is already structurally a lot more collaborative in the initial setup and premise and the execution that we'll be going for than what we've already done. To put it into context a little bit, the main campaign of D&Dark started off as a one-shot that I was doing for a different group as just like a fun little Halloween thing. It expanded into something a lot bigger than that once I realized I am incapable of keeping this contained to just a small one-off thing. So because of that, when I brought everybody on board for D&Dark, I already had all of the character sheets, I already had the basic setting, and everyone just kind of picked and chose their characters and kind of morphed and twisted them around their interpretation of them, and we just kind of let it organically grow in that way. But it was starting off in a place that was very pre-built, and part of that is pulling from the lore of the movies and the books and these sort of pre-established characters. What we're going with for our next season is going to be a lot more open-ended. I don't know if this will be the place where I drop this revealed info, but we're doing cryptids next season.
Ooh, I love cryptids. Cryptids are fun.
So because we're going with something that's got a bit less concrete, pre-established lore, that is much more like folkloric, it's way more open to interpretation, and the way that each of them have taken their individual characters for that setting has done a ton to influence the world building and what I'm setting up for it. And I'm excited about some of the directions we'll be exploring just because their ideas have really taken off in a cool way.
I think that's really cool. I think that as well, that's like kind of the strength and the importance. Like it's really important for everyone to kind of have that basis to explore these characters in nuanced ways, so everyone's prepared when you go into the recording. Because yeah, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to produce a whole setting, situation, and like everything that's in it, and to expand it. I really quite impressed. And when I listened to your stuff, I was like, oh, this is really cool, and it feels like that gothic style of kind of like, you know, I don't want to say it's like a creeping monster going forward, but it's like a creeping monster going forward. You know, it's like has that energy that I think is really on theme. So I'm excited to hear about cryptids next.
I definitely have my work cut out for me for general research. There's going to be a lot of different avenues that we touch on. Nothing is set in stone quite yet, but we already have our inciting incident is a thing that has happened in season 1. So just kind of expanding on that world building and playing in that sandbox. I'm excited. I am also trying to mentally prepare myself and give myself a decent break in between seasons to do that deep dive and be familiar enough to pull from that group of folklore.
For sure. I think it'll be very exciting. Well, thank you for sharing. I get to be the first person to hear this. Woo.
But that being said, just kind of going off of that sort of space, and for me, I do a lot of pulling from different media. Obviously, the Gothic media for season 1, a lot of folklore for what I'm planning for season 2, pull a ton from video games and movies and just things that I want to emulate in different aspects of the story. What pools of inspiration do you tend to look to when you're setting up your shows? Like, what does the prep work look like for you?
That's a very good question. I think our first campaign, Monster Mash, was in line with what you're describing. One of the influences we wanted to kind of do, one of the inspirations and influences was this idea of what if all of the monster manuals were wrong? You know, the victor writes history. So what if everyone who wrote those manuals was doing it incorrectly? What if adventurers were actually just creating stories about these creatures and coming up with false information that would disparage and make them seem more monstrous? And that was the initial kind of impetus for what we tried to do with campaign 1. The agency archives are this new kind of format that we're doing. I feel like it's very informed by the setting and the actual rules. because we're doing kind of a taskmaster where everyone has a mission statement, like they have an official mission statement they have to complete, and then they have a bunch of information that describes their character and maybe some like personal subquests they have to complete. It's kind of that video game initial style. So kind of pulling from that format of how would you design kind of like an objective in a game to complete in a certain amount of time, but then also what is in this setting and this rule set that makes it quite unique. Like our first one being Perils and Princesses, the rule set actually has rules that dictate like who's your fairy godmother, and you have to select a type of princess, but also a type of magic that you have that is connected to your abilities and powers. So like in our case, Chicken Parmigiano, they are a princess who has like kitchen magic, and she can make pasta sauce that can dissolve things and meatballs that knock people out. But this is all slightly altered, but it's still like based on that system that exists. Kitchen magic is real. I just changed the names of things to meatball. And that whole scenario, that kind of structure and how we build the mission statements is very informed partially by the rule system, by what's in that setting, what's already prepared there, and how are we changing it. Our new one that we've just recorded and we're going to be releasing once the last episode of Princesses is finished, we are doing D&D 5e, but if everyone had wild magic surges whenever you cast any spell, and it's an expanded surge table I found online. And I also had to alter 61 spells because half of everyone's spells have been changed into new spells that they don't know what they do until they cast them. So like Frost Fingers has become Frosting Fingers. Wish has become Fish, the famous one-word change story. So, but all of that is like very pulling from, okay, well, what is iconic about this system and this rule set? D&D, what's iconic about magic is the 8 schools. So like, how can we make a story about those 8 schools and how they're under threat? And also like, they're also kind of elitist assholes. And that kind of vibe kind of is all pulled from there. So I feel like in our show, especially Agency, we're probably, that's a little bit of a difference, is that we're really kind of building around the systems as well as kind of like an overarching mission. But because we're smaller in scope with those, like, whereas your new series and your first series, I feel like have like quite interesting grand arcs and more of a grand story. We're kind of the little guy variety podcast. We're like hey, come listen to 3 episodes where they solve the problem. But also it's more, I guess, focused. So it's been interesting to change how we prep, because Monster Mash was prepped more like a traditional D&D campaign, and our Agency Archives is kind of written like an episodic TV show of like, here's your 3 things, here's your thing, and can I fit an entire story onto 1 or 2 pages? And it's kind of an interesting shift.
Yeah, doing the shorter form storytelling definitely has its strengths and its place. It's certainly a lot easier to get people to commit to 3 episodes of a short campaign than 55 episodes of a grand overarching story. That's one of the things that I'm happy about with a couple of our bits of bonus content. We're currently right now re-releasing our Call of Cthulhu one-shot where everyone played the Scooby-Doo gang, and that's just a short, tight 4 episodes. It's probably the thing that I'm most proud of what we've done in our show, and it's an easier bite-sized thing to share. Even though I do love the longer form storytelling, and I think that my strength tends to come in with more payoffs for long building setups.
I really liked that episode series, though. Actually, I listened to the Scooby-Doo one, and I think it was really cool. And I agree with you, though. It's like, it's hard because you'll get your super fans. There'll be people who stay with you once you get to that 50 episodes because they really, really invested. Yeah, it's kind of the strength and weakness of it. It's also really hard in an audio format, I feel, to do it. As you know, it can be so difficult to catch people over 50 episodes because it's just listening. And, there's so many pressures on our time nowadays for different things. So what do you do? So for anyone who's listening to this, thank you for coming to listen to Danger Dan. Claps
thank
for you.
And thank you for coming to listen to Cav.
Hello.
But kind of going off of where I was going before, for Call of Cthulhu, that is one of the things that I'm most proud of. And I like how short it is as a thing that is easily shareable. I feel like the answer to this question is obvious because of the way you've been talking about Agency Archives, but I was going to ask, of your shorter, condensed campaigns, is there any that you are particularly proud of more so than the rest, and any that you would point to people as like, hey, here is the jumping on point that is the best representation of us?
Yes. Okay. So I would say that the best jumping on point for anyone is, in fact, Agency Archives. However, I have some favorites. There was a short Kids on Bikes series that we recorded very early on in our podcast time. So the audio quality is not as good as it once was, but it is very dear to my heart. It's called Moms in a Cadillac, and it is Kids on Bikes where they all played moms that just had kids at home. They were in small town, Upper Peninsula, Michigan. And the way they interact with their children was so funny. My brother was really type A, locks on every door, crazy. And everyone else was just like these moms who didn't really know how to handle their kids. But it was unhinged, and there were 2 episodes, and it was very fun. And I that is kind of one of my favorite ones. And then outside of that one, I feel like we've gotten really good feedback and we've enjoyed. We did one horror one that was great. It was horror in a department store. It was also Kids on Bikes because it was easier to run that way. I really liked our Perils and Princess one we did. Those are kind of my favorites of our past ones in particular. But I think for anyone starting, like absolutely, if you want to hear our best quality audio stuff, as well as like kind of something where we've, I think, streamlined more of our recording process, start with Agency Archives. And if you want to listen to something super weird, listen to Moms in a Cadillac. And if you want to listen to something that is upsetting, Teens in Space. We did a Teens on Space one. I was told by my cast members that maybe it should be burned. So if you want to see us at our worst, we have it up still. The ending of that one is I made a choice with an alien who was a couch with a man on it, and it went weird. It's a little bit Hitchhikers, a little bit like, what the hell is going on?
All right. Well, I've really only got one more question for you, and it's just something that I wanted to pick at what you were saying earlier, that you were going to school for game design, and that's influenced a lot of how you've been approaching your show and the way that you're building your campaigns and all of that. Are there any specific game design philosophies or bits of wisdom that you tend to let be your guiding light, or that you would want to share to anybody building their own system?
My response to that would be kind of a thing we were told a lot during that program. I think is also just true of my experience running any TTRPGs, is find the fun and follow the fun. Find and follow the fun, because it's so easy to get embroiled in your own setting because you built it and it's your baby and you love it. And like at the end of the day, it's weird because as a dungeon master, people sometimes I think forget that you're actually building a game for other people, and so you're really just like responding to everyone else at the table. And like you described before, like having to be collaborative with everyone is such an important skill for good DMs. I've had a DM once run a game for me outside of like a recording, and it was really hard because they loved their system. They'd worked on it as a kid. They loved their setting, and like it just didn't land because we didn't understand or really connect with that setting in the same way. And especially true for like missions and like goals, it's like keeping those kind of tied to player choice or like a character specifically is really, really important. I feel like the best sort of long form stuff has done what you've been doing, which is taking into account what other people want and what they find interesting and following that area, following that fun. And the most difficult stuff to run or deal with has been situations like outside of recording mostly, where there's a disconnect there, there's lack of communication, they don't feel like they can contribute, they don't feel like they get agency in building what they want to build or playing what they want to play. And then the other aspect for game design is mission design, which I think has been hard. I actually had a really good set of advice. It was from a random person who ran D&D. It was really good advice. They weren't even a game designer. It was just like a really observant point, which was like whenever planning a session, they were like, think of 5 things to do. And only 5 things, and make it so that you expect those things to kind of change and adapt. Like if they skip one thing, well, there's still another thing to do, and don't over prep, don't over plan, don't build out too far, because it's really hard to get people to get to that endpoint anyways in any TTRPG. I think our first campaign, because it was our learning experience, had more of this overarching planning. And I'm really happy we've kind of settled into being kind of the TTRPG variety show, because I feel like it provides so many more opportunities for players to play weird, interesting characters. And we kind of vibe with that. We really enjoy kind of the variety aspect of it and changing things up. And also like taking advantage of like, yeah, what if we really gamified this? what if we took this whole concept of like a storytelling and narrative and we gamified it so there's an overarching story, which is agency, like the agency exists and maybe the agency has something bigger going on, but like what if we focus on the minutia of what makes a game work in a TTRPG, which is literally solve problem, go to next problem.
I completely get that. I definitely find that it's a lot easier to overcomplicate things than it is to oversimplify them. And a lot of my experience prior to doing D&D and doing this show, it's actually a very weird place to draw experience from, but surprising amount of overlap in the skill sets. I was part of a homebrew community for a little bit for the card game Villainous.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there was a whole community and a Discord server of people basically making their own little custom homebrew decks and boards for that.
Huh.
And so I was involved in that for a couple of years. I fell off of that and kind of got away from that around the time that I started getting into D&D and started up with the show. But I definitely found a lot of wisdom from those card games because similar pitfalls of it's a lot easier to make something too complicated than it is to make it too simple. And so simplicity was a lot of the key there. And part of why I fell away from it was there was a whole curation team and an evaluation team. There was an official mod that people basically were trying to submit to get approved and be on. And the internal politics of all that ended up going a way that I didn't agree with and so kind of stepped away from. But one of the pieces of advice was presented in such a stupidly simple way, but that has been kind of my tentpole that I've latched onto as some of the best design advice I've ever heard. And it's doing things is fun. Not doing things is not fun.
Yeah. That's true.
It's such an obvious in hindsight thing and is such like a fundamental basic. And it's presented in such a simple, stupid, catchy way.
It's so true, though.
But I always kind of come back to that.
Yeah.
And so it's that player agency and setting up those tasks and trying to minimize the downtime where they don't have the agency to be making the decisions and choices.
Yeah.
And doing things.
Yeah. That's why the stun condition in D&D is a poor design choice, but it exists. So very fair. Completely agree.
All right. Well, that's the last of what I've got. Are there any other miscellaneous things that you want to add or bring up before we come to a close here today?
Oh, I have a quick question for you on the topic of doing, different settings. And you've done Call of Cthulhu before and D&D 5e. Is D&Dark planning to do any other systems in the future?
We are kind of dipping our toes into a bunch of different things, and what we've mostly done them as like little bits of bonus content. We've done 2 bonus campaigns, both of which were Patreon exclusives. One of them we've opened up to the general public, and we're kind of taking that as our sort of experimenting with different systems. For our main campaigns, we are probably still going to stick with 5e, but that may change going down the line. It depends on kind of what piques our interest.
Yeah.
Some other systems that have come up that I do want to try, I do want to do something in Kids on Bikes.
Yeah.
I recently bumped into the Dread system from another podcast that I'm setting up to interview, and I really want to explore something with that system.
Dread's cool.
My buddy Daniel, who plays Imhotep, like I said earlier, he hoards systems. So he's got a bunch of stuff that he's looking into playing that we might factor in at some point. He's got the Alien TTRPG.
Ooh.
I know he's got a couple of others that he's looked into. I think he's looking into the Cyberpunk system right now.
It's bulky. It's chonky and it's hard, but it's got a lot of interesting aspects.
I'm definitely open to and wanting to explore a lot more systems. We will probably do them in more bite-sized chunks as short little one-shots and bits as bonus content.
Yeah.
But if there's anything that we really glom onto, that might make its way into being a main campaign.
Yeah, for sure. I have a recommendation. I'm only going to plug this because I think it's really cool and people don't know about this system enough. It may not be within the theme, but Coyote and Crow is cool, but that's not the one I'm thinking of. I recommend Coyote and Crow too, but it's actually because it's just an indigenous run, like an entirely native team who created an alternative history TTRPG that's set in America. If like it was never colonized, it's very cool. And then the other one I recommend is Seventh Sea. If you want to try something different, Seventh Sea has been out for a bit. It's never really exploded in popularity to the point where other systems have, but it's also really interesting. It's like if everyone was Captain Jack Sparrow. If everyone was Captain Jack Sparrow, but also the Three Musketeers, but also like what's fascinating about that system is every culture has a unique magic system, which is super cool. And I've never seen that done before. So there's some interesting new ones to consider.
Thank you for the recommendations. Before we go, please plug your show and remind us one more time where we can find you.
Yeah. So again, everyone, thank you for listening. I am Cav from Only Wizards in the Dungeon podcast, the TTRPG variety show. You can find us on basically any of the platforms that host. Spotify's our kind of one we always push, but we are on like Google Podcasts and other podcast platforms. Just look up Only Wizards in the Dungeon and you'll find stuff. And please, everyone, if you have time, listen to one of our agency episodes. Last episode of Princesses is coming out soon. And then we're going to go into D&D 5e with completely messed up magic. So I hope that's fun for people.
All right. Well, thank you again for coming by and chatting with us. Once again, everyone, I'm Danger Dan Jers, and this has been Table Talk. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Table Talk, created, hosted, and edited by myself, Danger Dan Jers, with artwork by Jordan Nelson. Our guest this week was Cav from the Only Wizards in the Dungeon podcast. Links to his show can be found in the episode description. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, reach out to us at dndarkpodcast@gmail.com. Our theme song and outro was created by Jeremy Vellucci. Check out more of his works on Instagram at JeremyVellucci_RecOfTime. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time we have a guest take a seat at the table.